Section 5. What's wrong with the non-quantum consensus? Hodgson invokes the folk psychological view that an explanation of a person's actions or decisions can be given in terms of the person's decisions or his/her reasons for them. He also comments that this may be the most useful explanation. However, as he points out, consensus writers such as Putnam and Borden contend that this explanation is not contained within and is not reducible to the physical explanation. He adds that the consensus view denies that the intentional explanation could ever explain the occurrence of one rather than any other of any alternatives which might, because of quantum indeterminacies, be left open by the physical explanation. In other words, while the consensus view has to acknowledge the reality of quantum indeterminacy, it has no explanation for its resolution apart from meaningless randomness. As we shall see in later units, this reflects the conceptual inadequacy of trying to explain mind and consciousness in classical terms. As Stapp says, the concepts of classical physics that many neurobiologists are committed to using are logically inadequate because, unlike the concepts of quantum physics, they effectively exclude our conscious thoughts. From a different angle, Penrose questions the same classical consensus approach. He asks, how can it be that the most basic and fundamental phenomena of physics require the bizarre and counterintuitive theory of quantum mechanics to explain them, while many consensus theorists claim that the great mystery of human consciousness can be explained by the relatively simpler principles of classical physics. Stapp is very clear that contemporary quantum physics is essentially psychophysical, hence dualistic. Having affirmed this, he then turns to the great scientific endeavor to rationally connect the neurophysiological and psychological aspects of the conscious brain. In other words, the problem as to how the neurophysiological functioning of the brain can give rise to the phenomenon of consciousness as we all experience it. Stapp describes the problem as an attempt to understand, explain, or describe the connections between the two realms that are conceived of and are described in two very different ways. He then asks why neuroscience doesn't try the solution which quantum physics has developed for just this very problem. The answer, Stapp says, is because of the dualistic character of this quantum solution. Dualism is seen as a bête noire by many philosophers. Hence, the quantum approach tends to be peremptorily rejected because it belongs to this despised category. As an example of this rejection of dualism, Stapp quotes one of the most prominent philosophers of consciousness, Dennett. Dennett asks, what then is so wrong with dualism? Why is it in such disfavor? He then answers, a fundamental principle of physics is that any change in the trajectory of a particle is an acceleration requiring the expenditure of energy. This principle of conservation of energy is apparently violated by dualism. This confrontation between standard physics and dualism has been endlessly discussed since Descartes' own day and is widely regarded as the inescapable flaw in dualism. But, says Stapp, this conclusion of Dennett's is flatly wrong. According to Stapp, Dennett's argument depends on identifying standard physics with classical physics. The argument collapses when one goes over to contemporary physics, in which, due to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, trajectories of particles are replaced by cloud-like structures, and in which conscious choices can influence physically described activity without violating the conservation laws or any other laws of quantum physics. Contemporary physical theory allows, and its orthodox von Neumann form entails, an interactive dualism that is fully in accord with all the laws of physics. Stapp then brings in another two reductionist researchers into consciousness. Steven Pinker quotes the title of a book by Francis Crick, The Astonishing Hypothesis. This refers to the belief that they share, namely the idea that our thoughts, sensations, joys, and aches consist entirely of physiological activity in the tissues of the brain. Later, in the same article, Pinker says that consciousness turns out to consist of a maelstrom of events distributed across the brain. Stapp criticizes the vocabulary that both men use in these descriptions. He says, the phrase physiological activity needs to be replaced by psychophysiological activity, since this activity is being explicitly asserted to have psychological or experiential content. And again, Stapp insists that these events should be evidently labeled psychophysical events, since being located in the brain is a physical attribute, while being the components of consciousness entails that these events have psychological aspects. Stapp's point is that these apparently minor errors of vocabulary represent, from a quantum viewpoint, enormous and profound errors of conceptualization. Pinker refers to the famous hard problem of consciousness. He says, the hard problem is explaining how subjective experience arises from neural computation. The problem is hard because no one knows what a solution would look like, or even whether it is a genuine scientific problem in the first place. And not surprisingly, everyone agrees that the hard problem, if it is a problem, is a mystery. Stapp responds that the hard problem will inevitably remain a mystery as long as one's thinking is imprisoned within the fundamentally invalid conceptual framework postulated by classical physics, which has no rational place for consciousness. Within that framework, the problem is seen to be explaining how subjective experience arises from neural computation, since all that is given is mindless matter. But the mystery immediately dissolves when one passes over to quantum theory, which was formulated from the outset as a theory of the interplay between physical descriptions and conscious thoughts, and which comes with an elaborate and highly tested machinery for relating these two kinds of elements. Stapp's reference here is clearly to the Copenhagen school, making the consciousness of the observer part of the physical theory. This in itself dissolves the hard problem, or at least provides a basis for its solution.